Welcome back to another Storage Authority webinar. We're doing these on the second and third Thursday of every month, so we're excited to be covering winning the feasibility study. Quick intro to the team here. We have decades of experience in self-storage, real estate management. Well, we got Josh Parker with us.
Morning.
And we also got Mark Gooden. Myself, Garrett Bird here. And this session we're really going to be covering the high potential asset class of self-storage and being able to do a feasibility study and giving owners the tools to make the early stage decisions, so it's not automatically spending the big bucks on a feasibility study. So we're going to get going right out of the gate, so we're mindful of everybody's time. And we'll throw it to you, Josh.
All right, perfect. I'll get us going here. So, it says here 3 types of feasibility studies. I'm going to break down a little bit further, and I'm actually going to say that there's 5 types of feasibility studies, and 3 of them are done before you are going to pay for that third-party feasibility study and really dish out some money for that. And so, to start off, you've got to do your own. So it's easy to assume that there's only one that demand and P&L study, but these other ones you can do yourself first. They're going to save you a lot of time and money down the road, so you're not wasting time on something that's not going to work. So you start off with the land and zoning feasibility studies. That those are 2 different feasibility studies, one on the land and one on the zoning. And you're going to spend a lot of your own time, on that 2 to 12 hours to see if this is even going to, if the land and the zoning are going to work for you. Then you can do your own owner's demand P&L, and then you're going to do your third party. And then after that is the due diligence after the purchase, sale, and contracts are signed. So 5 different feasibility studies you're going to do throughout the course of your project. You can go ahead and jump to the next slide there. So starting out with this land and zoning. So, demand and profitability are going to be your main focus of your feasibility studies, but you can't neglect the land and zoning feasibility. Is this going to work? Your third party feasibility study is going to assume that the land and zoning works. They're going to assume that. So it's your job, before you get to that point, the very first thing is to make sure that the land works, to make sure that there aren't those restrictive land features, make sure that there's not restrictive zoning. We've done a lot of webinars and talks and stuff on land and zoning in the past. So we're not going to go too deep into it here, but if you do want to view any of those, you can email me. My email's there, josh@storageauthority.com, and I can send you links to those. You can also visit our YouTube page, and I'll put a link to that YouTube page in the chat there. But our YouTube page has all of our past webinars as well. But I do want to point out the pro tip here. When you're doing this land and zoning feasibility studies on your own, again, these are studies you're going to do on your own to get you started. The very first feasibility studies you're going to do. Check for those hidden zoning overlays or moratoriums that can block your project, even if zoning looks favorable. So it's really important to really do your own research right out of the gate.
Yeah, another quick tip here, Josh, too, is visit the planning office in person and early. Those type of relationships are going to help uncover those hidden risks. So that's important as well. All right, Mark.
All right, good morning, everybody. On the next 4 slides, I will be reviewing the owner's feasibility studies in a little bit more detail. After that, Garrett will do 4 slides on the third-party feasibility, how you can make, work with the third-party experts to get a better study that represents your property. But before I do that, Josh, I want to add one more feasibility study. So that brings us up to a total of 6. And that is the brokers or the real estate agents' feasibility studies. And plain and simple, all I can say is, they're unreliable. They even have a big disclaimer in them telling you they're unreliable. My favorite is when you see that their studies and it says, you can raise the rates by 30%. You can increase occupancy by 30%. On the face of it, it looks like that because everywhere in town they're charging $130, and at this facility they're only charging $100. But you have to remember, a lot of facilities were built in the 80s and 90s, and they're so far off of Main Street, you have to drive through the woods to find them, and you can't necessarily match the rates of the ones on Main Street with easy access. So, they say you can charge insurance and you can bring the occupancy up. Well, if it was that easy, why didn't the owner do it? So they're often doing 1 year and 2 year feasibility studies, assuming a lot of things. So, you've got to do a feasibility study on theirs to say, is that really true? Can I really do that? And especially as fast as they say that I can do that. Um, it's difficult. And often we just looked at one for a franchisee. It had $22,000. The first year it had no employee expense. And then they brought it up the next year to $22,000. So in both cases, you've got to have management and you've got to have employees. Just because the last owner ran the facility on his own and he had no management and he was there for whatever 5 hours a day. And when you take it over, unless you're planning on working there, and especially if you're going for a bank loan, the bank's not going to let you assume that you are working at that facility. And often you don't want to be. You can get a $20 an hour person, $25 an hour person that sometimes will do better than the owner. If you train them right, they'll work all day. Um, anyways, 70% of the third-party feasibility studies fail. In other words, you pay 8 grand, you get a report back says your land doesn't work. Well, that's just crazy. And what that tells us is there's not a lot of people out there that have the business sense. There's only about 3% of the population that are entrepreneurs or have that business sense, to business smarts to become an entrepreneur. But in my book, paying 8K for a third-party feasibility study to get denied makes absolutely 0 sense. We've done a ton of these third-party feasibility studies. We've never had a single one fail, and that's because we do our own feasibility study first. There is absolutely 0 reason for a third-party self-storage report to fail. You should just move on to the next site before you pay that. And the reason people actually fail in self-storage is because they don't know how to do a 1 hour feasibility study and move on to the next property. What happens is 6 to 12 months down the road, these people that are trying to get into self-storage, they haven't found land and they become frustrated. And they give up in 6 to 12 months of looking for land. Now, it sounds like a long time, but because they didn't know how to do a feasibility study, they would find a piece of land, take 3 weeks to study it, and sometimes even go through a purchase sale agreement and then pay for the third party feasibility study, got rejected. So they get frustrated. But the problem, if you don't know how to do a feasibility study, it's going to take you a long time to find a site because, we can reject 90% of the sites in less than 15 minutes. And then the next 5 we can reject in an hour. So if we do that, In the same 6-month period, we will get 10 times more sites. 10 times more sites, so we're more liable to find that site. So, that's why it's critical that you learn the basics and you do your own self-storage feasibility studies. So let me go over before we get into them, let me go over the various feasibility studies that you can do on your own and how much time they take. The very first one is a 20-minute study, just 20 minutes. And all you have to have a list of your parameters, and it doesn't meet these parameters or not. The land size and land price. You set those parameters. If it doesn't meet it, let's not look at something that's too expensive or is 1 acre when our land requirements is 4 acres. And we'll look at these requirements in the next slide. But so land size and price, if it doesn't meet it, on to the next one. The 3-mile population, you set that up, whatever it might be, 15,000 or 80,000. Doesn't meet it, on to the next one. Determine, if you're willing to do a self-storage zone change. If you're not, on to the next one. But even if you are, at least cross off some zones. You're not going to get a zone change from residential to a self-storage zone. So zone change or not, is it on Main Street, on a main road, and is it visible? Most of those are done online, can be done with an agent or apps or calling the town, but that can be done in 20 minutes and you can reject most of your properties. Add 40 minutes and that gets you a 1-hour study. What you do next is check the topo and wetlands online. You think you got 4.5 acres, but there's plenty of sites that will show you the topo, whether it's a local site or a national site. We have topo of the entire United States. If it's a cliff, it's not going to work. If there's a river flying through it, and on the same view, these maps have wetlands. Some of them are real accurate. Some of them are not so accurate, but at least it's a step in the right direction. So a lot of times, a 1-hour review, topo wetlands, you can reject that site. Next, if you want to add online demand and rental rate review, that's going to take an hour to do that. So now you have a 2-hour study. The next one takes 3 hours. That's walk the property. Walk the property, and start looking for features that's going to tell you can't build here. One great, well, we'll save that for the next slide. But so that's 5 hours. 8-hour feasibility study will include you visiting the competitions within 3 miles, at least 3 or 4 sites, and see what quality they have, see what service they have, see what rates and occupancy they have. So in 8 hours, you can do a pretty damn good feasibility study, and you're either going to put an offer in or move on. But like I said, 95%, 20 minutes. And then after you finish that 1-day study, the next study, you add another day, and that's where you have your team review it. You pay your engineer. If you're a franchisee, we've been reviewing it since the 20-minute review with you. But you put your team together, and then if it passes mustard, then you put that offer, it gets accepted. That's when you start doing your own due diligence and a third-party due diligence. All right, Garrett, let's pass to the next slide.
Yeah. Shoot, Mark, 8 hours, you figure for every feasibility study, $1,000 an hour, you're paying yourself to rule it in or rule it out. So it makes 100% sense.
Okay, so as the owner's responsibility, a lot of that falls on your shoulders early on. We talked about zone for self-storage. A lot of the times the brokers will tell you that. A lot of the times you can find that online. But to take it a step further, always call the town planner. Regulations change, and you're not going to see those overlay zones that Josh mentioned. So it's a 3-pronged attack: the agent, online, and talking to the town. The acreage, you've got to set that acreage up for yourself. because that's going to tell you. We use 4.5 usable acres if we want to build a 60 to 80,000 net rentable square foot property. Believe it or not, not all, even when everybody thinks everything is usable, like the agent, it's not. So set that up. Now, if you're going to build multi-story, you can cut the land in half. Sometimes even more because you're doing one building, so you're building in the driveway. So if you're doing multi-stories, not only you can cut it in half, you can cut it in more. So, but determine that and stick to it, whatever your number is. You start bringing me 3.5 acres to build 80,000 square feet of self-storage, single story, it's not going to work. You spend hours looking at it, and by the time I look at it, we could have rejected it early on. Now you have to buy the land, and often when you buy the land, you have to buy it before the bank. So you have to determine how much cash you have. And that will allow you to reject a lot of sites because they're too expensive for your budget. Um, so let me give you an example. I suggest that you should have, after you buy the land, you should have $500,000 for design, geotechs, environmental studies, attorneys, fees, bank fees, and have some cash left over. Okay, so if you have $1 million, you take out 500,000 for that design period before you get your loan. That leaves $500, 500,000 for the loan. At Storage Authority, we like to start with, that you need $1.5 million. You take out $500 and put it on the side for contingencies, design, all the things that happen before the bank loan. That leaves $1 million for the land. But we've had franchisees that have bought land for $2 million, but they had 2.5 million cash. So that's one way of knowing how you can determine what you can pay for land. Of course, when you do the P&L, just because you have the money doesn't mean you can buy a piece of land for $10 million. Doesn't mean it's going to work. But why look at land where we can't buy it? And make it to the bank point of the bank. And in the end, as you talk about land, you really got to visit that land. And I don't mean visiting the land from driving by it. I mean talking to the owner and saying, can I walk on your property? Downloading the Regrid app. The Regrid app is free, regrid.com. It's going to show where you are in this world. So when you're in front of that property, it's going to show the property lines. It's going to show where you are. Now you can walk that property along the property line through the woods, crisscross it. You know what? I've seen people, walk out there, and there's humongous overhead wires that nobody told them about. I've seen it where the trees have been cut because they have underground gas lines, which nobody knew about at the early stages. If you think it looks a little marshy and wetlands, it's definitely wetlands, because sometimes you'll think it's not wetlands and it will be wetlands. So that site visit is critical, that you do that early on. You can pay an engineer if you want to actually walk that site. It'll cost you $1,000 by the time he's done meeting with you. I'm all for it, but you should go with him. It makes it's your business. You're going to understand it. So really take a good look at land. A lot of it's online. A lot of it you're going to view early on. And then once you get your contract signed, you want to get your civil out there fast. And the first thing you want to order is a wetlands delineation, because the final wetlands is set by a soil scientist going out and doing little hand borings to test the soil. Because wetlands, not only do you have to stay out of the wetlands, there's usually a buffer that they either want you out of or regulate you. So wetlands are very detrimental. I'll just tell you one quick story. Our storage authority in that Kamal owned in where was Kamal, Garrett?
New
That was,
Jersey.
oh, that was in New Jersey, right? We've got a lot of facilities in New Jersey. It's a great place for self-storage. He brought me a map and he says, look at this. I can get 25 acres for 1.5 million. I'm gonna buy it. You know, I looked at the map, it had topography, it had wetlands on it. But you know, if you're not an expert, you wouldn't even notice there was a wetlands line. And I said, you've only got 6 acres non-wetlands. Oh, okay. That's why they're selling it so cheap for $1.3 million. I said, yeah, well, go ahead, offer him 800,000. Well, he offered him 1.2. They accepted the deal. We delineated the wetlands. We had a soil scientist go out. Wetlands can change. If they were delineated 10 years ago, they can change. Land gets flooded, it changed, or maybe it wasn't done properly. Our 6 acres became 5 acres. Okay. And he went from 1.2, 1.3 to 1.2. I told him this time you should go in at $600,000. Tell him, it's a change of scope. And you provided us maps by professionals saying I needed 6 acres. I'm going to lose square footage. Um, and he already had the deal at 1.2. He can always make a change. The guy accepted it. There's a backstory to it. The guy was 92 years old, no family. He just wanted to get rid of it. So he's accepted $600,000. So when you make an offer on a piece of property, you're assuming everything's good. And if it's not, you have that opportunity to renegotiate. All right, Garrett, let's go on to the next slide there.
Yeah, and real quick, so this picture we're all looking at too. This is an image of another New Jersey location in Glassboro. Owner Rick, and he's due to get a certificate of occupancy next month. But your mind would be blown if you knew how much he paid for this. Well under $1 million, but very diligent on looking for land, and ready to hit the market next month.
Yeah, and Garrett, before you go, Rick, before he got to this property, and this property required not a zone change, but a regulation change, which is kind of like a zone change. A zone change costs $10,000 to $20,000. It takes 2 to 4 months. He had done 3 zone changes before this. The town planner said everything is great and everything. He got denied 3 times in a row. I mean, I've never had a self-storage denied, and I've never had a site plan denied. But I don't go in for zone changes because there is that chance. But because this one needed a zone change, and it's actually a residential zone, a reg change, he got the land for half price. And there's a lot of different ways to find land for half price. A rear lot where the building's out front, and things of that nature. But any event, land is critical. One other thing he did here that the bankers really liked, when Garrett said he's opening, he's building the whole thing at once. I think it's about 100 and something gross square feet. He's building the whole thing at once. But he's opening the first 3 buildings about 6 months early because it's a year construction. And by doing that, every month you're open early, you make an extra 50 grand. So he's going to open this section 3 or 4 months at least before the next section. So that's an extra a couple $100. And I know Terry's in the banking business. Banks love that if you can open part of your facility early. And that's having a conversation early on with the building department, planning and zoning, the whole team at the town, not just 1 or 2 groups, saying, hey, if I do this, this, and this, can I get a temporary CO to help make this project work? All right, Garrett, next slide. We talk about being on Main Street. We talk about all these things. So again, the critical thing is going out to the site. I can tell you this, if you go out to a site and you pull out of the driveway without thinking, it's not a problem. At best, it's a C site. If you have to wait 1, 2, or 3 cars before you can pull out often, and this is between 4 and 5 at night during rush hour, between 4 or 5. If you have to wait for 3 or 4 cars in each direction, that's a B site. If you have to look for an opening in the traffic, and then you actually say to yourself, "Oh, I should have went on that last opening," that's an A site. Okay. Finding cars, we say minimum 10,000 cars, but some states and towns, the max they have is 10,000. I know you get to Tampa and other places. You have streets with 30 and 40 and 50,000 cars per hour during 24 hours. But go out there at 4 to 5 and see what the traffic looks like. After a while, you do this at a couple of sites, or you start thinking of this every time you go somewhere from now on, you'll notice the difference just by going out there. And it's got to have a great view. Even if it's on Main Street, but it's behind the grocery store, it doesn't work. You don't put a grocery store behind a self-storage, and you don't put a self-storage behind a grocery store. It's got to have the great view and great access. And again, the population and a lot of other factors can be determined early on. Either with the apps, you can go to, one of the things you should do early on to look at a main street and the population is, go to Google Maps, type in the address, go to Google Maps. You can see what everything looks like, where the population is coming from. And then put in nearby, and it'll show all the self-storages nearby on Google Apps nearby. And you can see if some of these self-storages have a better location, or actually you can see some of them were built in the 80s and 90s behind a grocery store. So that's going to make a big difference. You can see, is the population wealthy? Is the area scary? We all know the ladies rent. Well, drive to that facility, both on Google and in person, and that will tell you all you need to know about traffic and population. It doesn't take you to be a better expert than the apps that tell you about traffic and about the population and about the people in the apartments and those things. It can be done by driving around. And even these apps miss some self-storages, especially ones in under design. So look for signage, see what's going on. And the ones that these apps say are approved, go visit them. We had one where they had the same site twice in the counts. They had 2 different names for it, right next to each other, for 100,000. So even if they built it, it was only going to be 100 instead of the 200,000 they had in the apps. So you got to go out there. And then there was another one that was for self-storage. It was under construction for a car dealer. So you can't always trust the third-party apps. They're great for that 15-minute feasibility study, but after that, you've got to hit the roads. Next. Demand. Demand is the hardest one to pinpoint, even for the experts. One I've even seen where one will say it's good for 100,000, and another one will say it's good for 50,000. So everybody has their ways of doing it. But what we found over time, if the facilities that are 3 years and older are 80% full, there's some demand. And your goal is you're looking for places that are closer to 90% full at premium rates, that typically means there's a lot of demand. Okay. Now, if there's no pipeline or limited pipeline, the answer is clear. If there's pipeline, the answer is not quite as clear. But if you go back to that 80% guideline, if we can add to this and we're still at 80% and feel that we're going to be 80% full by us adding, a couple of square foot. It's a great way to go. Of course, we can use these apps, it still comes down to is what number do you use as reasonable for square feet per person? We talk about 7 to 8 being the average state, but there's like several states, I think even California and New York, and there's several states that are under 5 square feet per person. So you can't go by square feet per person. That's just a check. So you gotta visit. You gotta. I say you gotta do 3 things. You gotta call the facilities. You got to visit the facilities. You got to go to their app, their websites. Their websites, I was just checking out a site, it had 3 different sizes listed, one left. I could see online it's a big site, but if they only had 3 sizes, 3 different units left, all the rest were there, man, that's more than 90% full. So check their websites out. If they're missing some sizes, like a 10 by 10 or 10 by 20, or have a lot of one left, that's a very good sign. At Storage Authority, given today's interest rates, because this will change with interest rates, but given today's interest rates of 8%, we like to be able to charge an average of $1.60 a square foot of the for the net rentable square feet. Some people will do it lower, some people want higher, but that's the minimum that we want to be able to charge. I'm not saying that's what the competition is charging, because we have proven with the right location, the right design, the right operation platforms, the right sales platform, and the right marketing platform, that we can charge 10 to 15% day one than the highest facility in town. And we can certainly charge 30% more than the average of all the facilities. But our manager never greets anybody standing down. In fact, our managers don't greet people from behind the counter. They have to be in front of the counter. Now, if they can get in front of the counter fast enough, they open the door for our customers. You're not going to find that. And I said if they're built right, people say, well, what does that have to do with renting? Well, we put a 10 by 20 inside the unit. That makes sure we have some time to talk to people, more signage inside that unit, and they get to see what a unit looks like. The more, if they come in and say, what's the price of a 10 by 10, and you give it to them, they're liable to walk out. We built a unit in our showroom, so we have the time to get their phone number, get their name, get some more information about them. So, they've taken the time to say, hey, I like this site. This makes a lot of sense. And that way, one more step in them renting to us. Spick and span clean, lights, everything that, a lot of facilities, more facilities than you realize, are outdated. If your mindset is not a real estate investment, if your mindset is a hospitality, we've got slat walls full of locks. We got shelves full of products. We're trying to make it feel more like a retail. We got a coffee bar in our self storages, with a nice top and free coffee, free water, free candy, all that. You see that when you walk into a hotel. So design has to be part of knowing that you can charge more. Because if you're afraid of competition, you're going to find it tough to build at 8% interest rates. But if you're not afraid of competition, now is one of the best opportunities in self-storage. Thanks for this picture, Garrett. You're showing my nice haircut I see there. And here I'm down in Sarasota, roof's over me. I'm outside enjoying the day. You take a look here. I'm doing a little conceptual plan. It looks just like the site we saw in the last one. So a little quick conceptual does a lot. We don't wait 3 weeks for our engineer to get a conceptual back. Because here's what I have found is when people find a site that might work, they stop looking. And if it might work, often it takes them a month to figure out that it won't work. So we're back to that 20-minute demand review. You've got to do that. You've got to know what your requirements are. I'll help you set them and explain to you why each one of those should be set for your budget, for your location, what state you're in. This isn't cookie cutter like people think. Everybody wants to know what it is, but then they wonder why I'm asking what state you're in. When do you need cash flow from this? How long are you going to own it? Is it for the next generation? How much time are you going to put in? So all that, feasibility has a lot to do with you and your team, and then it has to do with the rest of the environment. Let's see if that's my last slide. So I'm going to turn it back to Garrett, where he's going to talk about, dealing with third-party feasibility experts and how to make sure you get your money's worth there. All right,
Yeah,
Garrett.
one more, Mark, but I did want to add a quick note on this that, most owners, they don't understand, supply by unit mix, or they misunderstand how absorption works in storage. So it's really having that perfect unit mix, because every unit size and mix is its own little business. So you really want to build out your facility to where if everybody's sold out of their 10 by 10s or 5 by 10s, you want to go heavier there. The whole goal is to lease up fast, but lease up the whole facility at once. If you fly through your 10 by 10s, then you got something wrong there. So that's something else where you got to get a little more granular to when you're building out your unit mix.
Yeah, and part of that is talking with the other self-storages. Part of that is knowing if you're in the north or the south, because it's not only the unit mix, it's climate control versus non-climate control. I'm seeing a lot of places down south where the non-climate control is more than the climate control because everybody assumed we just need climate control. And the fact now, a lot of areas are running out of non-climate control because the REITs are building these monster 3, 4, 5 stories with all climate control. So you're right, Garrett. Look at climate control versus non-climate control, and then in the end, get it down to the right mix of unit sizes. This is my slide, Garrett.
Um, yeah, it is, but I got it. If that's my that's my article, I might as well take it, right?
It doesn't matter to me. I'll take half of it and give it the other half to you.
All right, sounds good.
I don't need to get a third-party feasibility study. Our franchisees don't need to get a third-party feasibility study because we've done one with them. But you know why we need them? Because the banks require them, especially if you're going with an SBA loan. So, you're going to need that. So not only you might as well get your money's worth because you're spending, $8 grand. It can go up or down depending where they visit. So they're going to give you different things. They're going to spend more time. They're kind of cookie cutter. If you look at 6 of them, 135 pages each, it's like I go to the same 10 pages. But they give some neat things in their opinion of rental rates, absorption rates, their opinion of construction costs. I like their opinion of construction costs because sometimes early on, and new people in the business talk to a couple of contractors who said you can build. Well, if everything's perfect, you can build for $65 a square feet. Well, I haven't seen $65 a square feet for years, but contractors will still put that low price in to make sure when it's time they get a call. So, we know monthly expenses are 30% when we do our mini feasibility if you're the average size. If you're smaller, it might be 40%. It might be smaller. If you're a larger facility, the expenses will go down. But if you're 20,000 square foot facility, your expenses might be 40%. But these guys actually break it down when they do it. We don't try to figure out what the electricity is. We use the percentages of the income when we do our preliminary personal feasibility studies. And again, so a lot of this stuff was covered. If there's anything you want to add, Garrett, before you go into your slide,
Yeah,
for,
it's, I mentioned, wrote this article a while back for ISS, and one of our locations, Mulberry, Florida, they had back to back to back 100 unit lease in months. Now, a little bit of an anomaly. Now they really bought into our marketing system and how we approach outward marketing, being the hometown self storage. But it solves a lot of problems when you can put together a good marketing plan, lease up fast. Self storage is our vehicle, but we are in the hospitality business, so you really have to take care of that customer, take care of that community. It spreads like wildfire, and that's how you get those rapid fire lease ups. But that helps with getting to break even much faster.
yeah, and when we say marketing, and you said they followed our suggestions, Garrett, you and I went to that grand opening, and I was amazed. I think they gave the town staff the day off to come to this because I mean, everywhere I turned, there was the fire chief, the police chief, the mayor, the zoning guy. So it was on a Saturday, so they had to come on their own time. We do our grand openings on a Saturday, but we had 30 town employees there. But that's part of getting to know them as a business owner, as a self-storage owner, but also as a friend and neighbor. And that makes a difference because people like to do business with friends when in this type of business. So all right, Garrett, back to you.
All right, thanks, man. All right, now we got to get into, it's time to spend some money. We did all of our legwork as owners, and now we're looking to bring on a third party consultant, feasibility consultant. And a good consultant can make or break your project, but you need to ask the right questions to ensure their report is very accurate. And you really got to treat this almost like an interview with these consultants, like a job candidate. Ask about their process, the data sources they use. All that's super important because this is part of your business plan. Visiting the site or not. That's huge because you can only get so much information from desktop studies, and technology is great. Um, but if you don't have boots on the ground, you're not getting all the information. Even with the Google Street View, you can drive by and take photos of the facility like you were there. But if you don't actually go in to the site, shop them, get a good feel of their customer service, it's just not the same. So you're not capturing all the information. So it's super important that when you are hiring a consultant, that they're going to come out and put boots on the ground, so you can get true data in. Other questions you need to ask them. What type of rates are you using? Too many times we're seeing that they're sticking to web rates and web rates only. It's just not. There's very few projects or performers that are going to make sense if you're only using web rates. So if you don't get that true in-store rate, and a lot of times you can see that by what the web rate or teaser rate is that you see online, and then you'll see the in-store rate. The unknown is how fast is that in-store rate going to get accomplished. Just recently, in the last like 6 months, we rented a unit here in Sarasota, and within 2 months, they literally gave a $70 rate increase. So these new customers to self storage, they think they're getting in at rock bottom prices, but it's a teaser rate, gets them in the door, and then they rapid fire get you to that top tier rate. So that's the rate you really want to base your projects on. Most feasibility consultants, they just think you're going to be an average owner, average rates, average marketing. And it's nice to see that risk averse approach and the banks like that, but we want to blow those numbers out of the water. Another thing that's very important as well is how they're going to build it out. Are they going to use an SBA and conventional? A lot of our owners go with the SBA because we're talking 15% down of a project versus 30% plus down of a project. That's a big swing. So you got to see if it's built out that way as well. And then pipeline data. Again, something you can do online, seeing what projects are coming to market or not. But going down to the town planner and having those conversations, that's when you really know if this project's stalled out or not. You don't want to use that data and, you know, have that hedge your decision on, am I going to build here or not, thinking this facility is going to come to market and it never does. And then you're on to the next one when that was a solid site you just walked away from. So, it's questions you gotta ask the consultant early on. It's definitely information you need, especially if you go SBA, they're based in injecting 85% of the project off of these conservative feasibility consultants reports. So it's definitely part of the process here.
Garrett, real quick before you move on, and Garrett said there was a $70 rental raise. That's correct. And it was on a $65 price. So, it was a 10 by 10 for $65. Great. You ask the manager, when's that rate going to increase? I have no idea. Well, 30 days later, we got a notice, and that's not the only one. We have all of our franchisees actually go out and rent a rate because it's crazy how these REITs are doing that. But the effective rate is, what's the rent over a year? Because the average person stays well over a year. So if you charge 65 for 2 months and 135 for 10 months, the effective rate is, somewhere in that middle. And that's what, it's more closer to even the office rates are raised by these guys and before, several months. So it's tough to figure that. And so a lot of these guys are still using the online rental rates, which, you're not going to make it on that. And the REITs don't make it either. They raise them. On the pipeline projects down below, that you need to go check every pipeline project, drive by that site. So when your feasibility guy is doing it, you can tell him why this project is not real. It already moved on. It's something else is built there. It's in the backwoods. Nobody's ever going to build there. It's off the main road because that will lower the square foot per person. And even though that's a bad thing to evaluate self-storage on, it's an easy thing to do. So a lot of people do that as a check. So do your own verification of the pipeline projects. Even the one that say are under design or under approval, call the town. And if the town says, hey, nothing within us yet, you can let your feasibility study guy know that. Go ahead, Garrett.
Information we provide these third-party feasibility consultants, the more complete the site package you can give them, the better the report. Missing items is going to equal, generic boilerplate output. So solid data in to the feasibility consultant, the more accurate, they're going to be when they come up with a report. You want to highlight, nearby high demand drivers, apartments, colleges, hospitals. These are gold for demand modeling. You also want to point out, competition that's not really competition. If they're just using this 40 or 50,000 square foot facility that has barbed wire, or they don't have a manager, but they're gobbling up that supply in your area, that's not the competition we're going against. They might be looking for the bottom feeders in the market. Well, we're a price leader. So it's just not the same. So providing that, information to the consultant is helpful as well. All of it comes down to, more accurate of a report, but, bottom line is you don't want to swing their data either. I'll cover that on the next slide. You're paying them a lot of money to have a non-biased report and, give you that data back, but you want to point out things to them that they might miss, which is going to be extremely important for that final report for you.
Yeah, Garrett, real quickly, we have we have a facility under design, and 2 miles to the north, the homes are 150. Now, the incomes are 150,000 per person. The rental rates are humongous. 2 miles to the south, everything is just half the price. you know? And so where is the break off between one side of town and you know, the good side and the bad side, because they're all 2 miles away? Well, the feasibility guy decided, you know, it's just to the poor side, you know. But how can you decide that without going out there? How can you decide that without talking to the town? It just so happens that the town is redoing past our property towards the lower end. So they're starting at the high end, coming down, and they're doing like a $20 million renovation up and down the street, you know, helping people with their buildings, you know. So everything is going our way. I felt the prices should be somewhere in between the two versus the consultants on the low end. Um, so you got to do your review yourself, and let them know what you found. But again, you know, when you give them your conceptual plan, usually when you do a conceptual plan, you put the most that you can get on there. But you don't want your feasibility guy saying, "Hey, I took this from the owner," because the bank is going to ask, what do you mean you took it from the owner? Do you believe in it or not? Because they'll put qualifications in. If you make them say X, Y, and Z, they're going to put a qualification in. This is from the owner, and the banks don't like that. They want to hear what the feasibility guy says. Just because you can fit 300,000 square feet on the property doesn't mean it's feasible financially or demand wise. Go ahead, Garrett.
All right, now getting into what not to provide to third-party feasibility consultants. Now, like I mentioned on the last slide, let the data speak for itself. You know, you're hiring them for an objective view, not confirmation of your bias. Think of this at like a home appraisal. You know, you don't tell them what the value of the house is. So you want to hear their information and what they're giving you. You know, it's not always accurate, but you want to hear from their eyes and their experience what they're seeing. Um, you know, slide a couple back when Mark was covering the traffic, that was an image of our Land Lakes location. The feasibility consultant said it was going to take 17 months to lease that facility up. And, you know, we did that in 7. So again, you know, safe, risk averse approach, but, you know, we definitely want to blow those numbers out of the water. So, you know, and you don't want to puff up the report too and give, you know, $2 rates, $2 square foot rates when the average is $1.30. And the bank's not going to want to see that either. And like Mark mentioned, if you force the consultant to use those numbers, there's going to be a little asterisk next to it saying provided by the owner, you know, and then that might not be accepted. So, you know, let them do their job. You're paying them a lot of money for it. You know, we're going to go through multiple reviews of it of, you know, if it's all accurate um, or not, and then review it one more time before we provide it to the bank. Coming into you know, now they completed their feasibility study and they give you the first draft. You know, now it's time to get to work to check them to make sure it's all accurate. You know, we've seen too many times where, you know, these are 120 140 page reports, and you know, too many times it's copy and paste or it's from another state. You know, everybody makes mistakes, attorneys make mistakes, feasibility consultants make mistakes. So you just got to check it. This is your project. This is your capital at stake. So you know, with a fine tooth comb, you got to go over it with your team. You know, obviously we're reviewing it for our storage authority owners. You know, making sure everything checks and balances. You know, are they using only the web rates here? You know, why aren't they using the in-store rates or in between? So all that's super important on reviewing that final draft, because this is what you're going to be providing the bank when they're looking at it. So, you know, before you send it to them, you know, definitely review it internally, maybe one more draft from there, and you know, then you go from there. This screenshot here, this is a recent article in MSM, you know, one of our sponsors for the webinar here, and you know, Mark and Brad Hatfield kind of went through, you know, how you save $1 million on your next development. So if you haven't got to read that, that was back in May. Go ahead and check that out. All right, so that was pretty much a quick down and dirty how to do the feasibility study from your level, boots on the ground, owner's level, to hiring a feasibility consultant. The big takeaways, always run your own numbers before you hire a consultant. Don't just frivolously spend the money, just because you found a good site. So that's super important to put that time and energy in. Again, we do that with our owners. So when it's time to order a feasibility study, we know it's going to pass. You use conservative assumptions, test your pro forma, for worst case scenarios. Obviously we want to hit the grand slam, but let's protect the downside as well. So we want to run all those numbers both ways, and then early and thorough due diligence saves money, time, and headaches down the road. So spend that, like Mark mentioned early on, spend that hour. Next step, spend the 2 hours. Now you're on 4 hours, and if you get to 8 hours, great. You're on to a possible good site, but it's worth putting that time and energy in, for what you're, the accomplishment of owning a multi-million-dollar real estate asset. It takes time, it takes energy, it takes work to do. Couple of these images here, these are some of our owners that kind of really, head down, went through the whole process, and busy professionals. They didn't know anything about self-storage, but they stayed the course looking for land. Bottom left, that's Kamal, who Mark mentioned, the site where he found 25 acres. And it's just it's a process. If you're starting today, expect it to be a 3-year process. It takes time, and it's supposed to. The environment's going to look different, but there's a lot of individuals that are skeptical because they're uncertain times. But uncertain times means opportunity for the ones that forge ahead. Quick shout out to all of our sponsors here. We appreciate everybody who supplied putting this webinar on. If anybody wants an introduction from a contractor to bank, please just reach out to me, and I'll be happy to introduce you to any of our sponsors here. But big thank you to everybody on this page. Now we're going to open it up to Q&A. So if anybody has any questions, feel free to put it in the chat. Feel free to unmute yourself and ask any questions that way as well. But we're here to help. This is part of our giving back to our industry that we love so much. All right, not seeing any questions. Going on to the our next webinar is going to be July 17th, and we're going to be hitting 45 guerrilla marketing tactics for big rewards. So we're talking about, if you want to fill your facility up fast, be sure to tune in to this next webinar. If you're registered, you should be registered for that one. If not, you'll see the link on in our newsroom that you can go ahead and join that way. If there's any Oh, we got a quick question here from Mitchell.
Hey
And then we
guys.
got
I appreciate you guys putting on these things. I love it. So I'm doing, we're not building, multi-story, but we've got some projects going in Michigan. And it's interesting, you hear a lot about like the 3% on lease up. And I know this is coming from like feasibility reports, and it's interesting because like I built a phase project. And we leased up right around that 3%. And I've also built, like 70,000 square feet. And those numbers, just because you're at 3%, it's interesting. I guess, what do you guys, I know your markets are a little different, but when you get that information from like a feasibility report, what is your guys' projections on lease up?
Well, a couple of different things. You usually get one from like you say, the third party feasibility story. So it's a tough question for us to answer. We seem to beat those every single time. So it depends on if you're treating it as a real estate business or if you're treating it as a hospitality business. When Garrett was at his facility, he was the manager of a brand new 3-story facility. They were putting in 60 units a month. And every month I'd call Garrett, how many did you put in this month? 62. How many this month? 67. Now that was more than double the feasibility study. And after he did that for, was it 6 or 7 months? I said, Garrett, we need you on the storage authority side so you can help everybody do that. So, we don't want to tell everybody they can rent up at half the time of their feasibility study, but it's only limited by that. And the population does have a lot to do with it. If there's only 10,000 people, I don't care. There's a limited number of people. But if there's 100,000 people, even though you could have the same square feet per person in both towns, but there's 100,000 in the 3 mile, you can steal more customers. When there's 10,000 and there's no other self-storage, there's no customers to steal because you just got 10,000 people. You're the only self-storage. You're going to get practically all of towns, but I'd still rather be the guy with 100,000 people at the same square footage. So every site is different. We see feasibility studies typically between 24 months and 5 years to fill up to 90%. So even the feasibility studies depend on where you're located, what the competition is, what the population is. But obviously the less competition, and if you've got a premium location and everybody else is on the back road, man, the brand new guy is going to come to you first. And before COVID, people used to check out 2, 3, 4 facilities. Now, after COVID, if your facility feels just right, they'll rent at the first facility. So we make every effort, every piece of landscaping. Josh was out at one of our sites cutting the tree branches because it was avoiding our view from the street a little bit. So we cut them before they got in the way. So there is no one answer that we can give you.
No, that's perfect. Thank you guys. Appreciate it.
Yeah, just to add to that, Mitchell, it's always been bizarre to me that, we build these multi-million-dollar self-storage facilities and then, we sit back and wait for customers or, obviously the REITs will throw money at pay-per-click, but, sometimes I'll see tree trimmers or lawn service do more marketing than I see a self-storage facility. So, if you really want to dominate that 3 mile radius, you got to take care of the community, you got to take care of the customer, and it can't just be digital spend. You really got to get involved, and that's really what helps lease up facilities.
Garrett, how many months in a row did you put 60 people in or 60 something people?
It was 6 months doing 60 to 80 in that range.
Yeah, and then he came to work for us because there was no choice. He was just, it was too good. But I can tell you this, Garrett had Santa Claus come in, in December. How many self-storages do that? Garrett understood every dollar he spent in marketing, he was getting $5 back. That was immediately, but over time, he was getting more money back because, people saw this enough marketing 12 times in a row from Garrett, they would think of him first. So marketing is a big key to being successful. And the banks don't want to give you a credit if you're going to do more marketing than the next guy, but that's okay. You can still get that bank loan and just beat all the third party rates and rental rates and fill up times.
A couple more questions came in here, Mark, from Sal. And we love Florida here, Sal. How is the market in South Florida? Do you guys have any successful projects out there?
Well, I'm not sure what you mean by South Florida. You know, it depends. Miami's, you know, it's a great place. But places like, you know, California has low square feet per person of self-storage because land is so high. I expect the same thing in Miami. We don't have any self-storages in Miami. It's very expensive to buy land down there. So you know, it's got to be reasonable land prices for our franchisees. They're not going to go out and spend $5,000 on land. The land could be worth it because they're going to build, you know, 10-story self-storage there and with high rates. But that's not the market we're in. We're in the market where you can buy 4 or 5 acres for $1 million or $1.5 million. But Florida works. We've got a guy getting in California where land's a little bit more expensive. You just got to go further to the outskirts to find that land. So, you know, I believe in South Florida like any other place, but certainly, you know, it's got to find the right city, the right town, and now it's pretty easy to check with a lot of apps. It's pretty easy to check you know, a whole area. You know, you can check several towns in 2 or 3 hours using the apps to see what the rental rates are. And it's easy to go online to get an idea of prices. Um, you know, we build in areas where the real estate agents tell us, oh yeah, you need 2 million, 3 million, but that's fine. We find the land that works. But when the real estate agent tells you you need 10 or 15 million or 20 million to find 4 acres, then we know the land's too high for us.
Another question from Prashil. You guys mentioned having 60 to 80,000 net rentable space. What are the pros and cons of doing something that size versus going smaller, about 40 to 50,000 net rentable?
Well, the more if the demand is there, the more square footage you can build, the more profit you're going to make. If the demand's not there, yeah, you should be building 40 to 50. But if the demand is there, build 40 to 50 if that's your cash flow, and design the rest and build that in phase 2. The larger your facility, the less the overhead affects you 100% because it's distributed over more square foot. And that's why the larger you build, you still only built 2 signs, a building sign and a ground sign, but you distributed over 100,000 square feet versus distributing that cost over 50,000 square feet. You know, as long as you get to 50,000 gross net rentable, it's a good size. The REITs will buy it, but it means you're gonna have to buy the land a little bit cheaper, you know, because it's just difficult to show a profit at 8%. But it's a great size, 50,000 square feet. It can be run by one person during the week. You know, but you just can't afford to spend as much on the development.
Thinking about Land O'Lakes, Mark, that was probably one of our smaller ones, 60,000 gross, probably 52,000 net rentable. But I always refer to it as our Mighty Mouse. This is the one that leased up in 7 months, and then the rates were strong there too. I think they were commanding like $1.75 a square foot, and then rapid fire leasing up. So all that goes into play as well.
Right. If you got high rates, 40 to 50,000 is going to make you a good income. So it depends on a lot of things. You know, but it starts with your cash flow. How much cash are you ready to invest personally, knowing you can take a bank loan with 15% down? But I wouldn't build less than 40,000. I just wouldn't. It's hard. The resale value is much lower per square foot because the REITs don't want to buy small facility. 40,000 is the minimum they buy, but they'd rather see 50,000.
I think that's it for the questions. Any last questions before we sign off here? All right. We appreciate everybody who joined us today. Hopefully you got some golden nuggets and pro tips that you can use out there and the venture you're going on. If you ever want to reach out to us, we're always available. Just to have a conversation. If you're thinking about building self-storage and you need a team on your hand, we're here for you. You can go through the discovery process with us and see if we're a good fit. But, please join us on the next one. That's July 17th. And we're going to be covering, like I mentioned before, those 45 guerrilla marketing tactics that helps your facility leased up and stay full. So appreciate you, everybody joining, and we'll see you next time.